Hello, and welcome back to another evening of shared stories and late-night rabbit holes. If you're settling in right now, getting your pillow sorted, pulling a blanket up around you, maybe turning the light down a bit lower, good. That's exactly where I want you. Comfortable. Not going anywhere. Just here. Tonight we're heading somewhere familiar. We're going to a small, fictional mountain town in Colorado, a place where it seems to snow permanently, where the children never age despite the fact that they've been in fourth grade since 1997, where the laws of physics are more like polite suggestions, and where some of the strangest and darkest and most quietly fascinating things in animated television history have been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. We're talking about South Park. Now, before we get into any of it, and there genuinely is a lot of it, just take a moment. Find your position. Get the pillow where it needs to be. If you got something to drink nearby, take a sip. If the light needs adjusting, adjust it. There's no rush here, none at all. This is the kind of night where we settle in first and start talking second. And if you happen to drift off somewhere in the middle of all this, at any point, at any section, that is completely fine. That's kind of the point of being here. The stories will still be here when you wake up. We can pick up wherever you left off. Right, South Park. If you've never really watched the show, you've almost certainly heard of it. It's the animated series that's been running on Comedy Central since August 1997, which, when you stop to think about it for a moment, is a genuinely extraordinary length of time. As of 2025, the show has produced 338 episodes across 28 seasons, with more still being made. The renewal runs through at least 2030. The show is older than Google. It's been running continuously for longer than some of its current fans have been alive, which is a fact that sits a bit strangely if you look at it too closely. The show follows 4 boys in that small Colorado mountain town. There's Stan Marsh, the everyman of the group, the one who tends to react to the surrounding chaos with a kind of exhausted, reasonable disbelief. Stan is the character the show most often uses as its moral compass, its voice of sanity in situations that have long since left sanity behind. He's grounded in a way that makes him the right lens for a world that is consistently, aggressively wrong. Then there's Kyle Broflovsky, Stan's best friend. Kyle is Jewish. He's smart. He has a temper that surfaces when things become genuinely unjust. And he's the one who most consistently argues that the town should behave better than it does. Nobody listens to him generally, but he keeps arguing. There's something quietly admirable in that. Then there's Eric Cartman. Cartman is, well, there are entire sections of Tonight devoted to Cartman because he deserves them. He's loud, manipulative, self-centered in a way that's genuinely impressive in its scope. And he is, for reasons that remain somewhat philosophically troubling, one of the most beloved characters in the history of American animated television. He's also, I'd argue, the show's actual protagonist, though the show itself has never officially admitted that. More on this later. And then there's Kenny McCormick. Kenny wears an orange parka with the hood pulled so tight around his face that you can barely see his eyes. And when he speaks, his voice comes out muffled by the fabric into something between a mumble and a murmur. You usually can't make out what he's saying. Kenny is the poor kid. His family lives on the wrong side of town. His parents drink too much. And for the first several seasons of the show, his defining characteristic was that he died. Frequently, horribly, creatively. And then came back next episode without anyone mentioning it. Kenny, too, has an entire section devoted to him tonight, because underneath what appeared to be a running gag, there is something genuinely dark and genuinely fascinating. Now, on the surface, South Park looks like chaos. Fart jokes and celebrity parodies and deliberately offensive material deployed with what feels like total abandon. It is all of those things. And for many people, that's the whole story. It's a loud, irreverent, sometimes brilliant, frequently crude animated series that's been doing its thing for a very long time. But here's the thing, if you look carefully, and we're going to look very carefully tonight, There are patterns underneath the chaos. There are threads that run across seasons, sometimes across decades. There are character arcs that were seeded in the early years and didn't resolve for over a decade. There are things the show changed quietly without announcement or explanation. There are secrets in the production itself, in how the show gets made, what gets cut, what never makes it to air at all. There are episodes you genuinely cannot watch anymore. And there is, sitting underneath all the satire and the shock humor and the cartoon violence, a remarkably personal autobiography of two men making a show about the world they live in. That's what tonight is. We're going to go through the conspiracies, not just the fan theory kind, though there are a few of those, but the real ones. The ones hiding in production history, the ones hiding in character mythology, the ones hiding in the show's relationship to censorship and real-world consequences. The ones hiding in a name that meant one thing for 20 years before anyone officially changed it, and the one hiding in the very identity of the show itself. The question of what South Park is actually about, once you strip back the surface. We'll move slowly, we'll take it section by section. And wherever you are in all of this, awake and engaged, half listening, somewhere in between, that's the right place to be. But first, one more moment to get settled. If you've been lying there for a while and you found your position, good. If you're still adjusting, take the time. There's genuinely no rush tonight. A long video like this isn't a race. It's more like having something interesting playing in the background of the room while you drift. You don't have to track every word. You don't have to retain anything. The information will settle around you, and whatever sticks will stick, and whatever doesn't was probably already doing its job just by being there. The show has been part of the cultural furniture for such a long time now that it's easy to take for granted how specifically it was constructed. Those four boys aren't arbitrary. Each one does a particular job, and together they cover more emotional ground than any one of them could manage alone. Stan is the show's ground, the one who sees things clearly and wishes sometimes that he didn't. He's not the funniest or the most clever, but he has the most reliably calibrated moral compass of the group, which makes him the show's primary lens when it wants the audience to have a stable perspective on the insanity happening around everyone. When things go very wrong on South Park, and they go very wrong very often, Stan's reaction is usually the reasonable one, which makes him slightly tragic in a context where being reasonable has no practical value whatsoever. Kyle is the show's conscience. He argues, pushes back, insists on standards that the world consistently fails to meet, and does all of this with an energy that is sometimes genuinely admirable and sometimes utterly exhausting, and in many episodes both at once. Kyle cares in a way that the show doesn't always reward caring. He keeps doing it anyway, season after season, which is either a testament to his character or an indictment of his judgment, depending on your mood. Cartman is the show's engine. We'll spend a significant amount of time on Cartman tonight because he deserves it. For now, he's the character who makes things happen in the way that a destabilizing force makes things happen. The majority of the show's significant events trace back to Cartman, something he wanted, something he started, something he set in motion from a mixture of ambition and resentment and a self-regard so complete it borders on genuine philosophy. And Kenny is the show's secret, the one who knows more than anyone else, whose knowledge is invisible to everyone around him, whose presence in the story is both absolutely central and perpetually overlooked. He's been dying in that orange parka for nearly 30 years. The reason why is considerably more fascinating than a running gag. So, let's start at the beginning, because the most interesting conspiracy in South Park might be the one hiding in the story of how it was born. There's a version of South Park that Fox was supposed to make. In the early 1990s, before the show existed in any official sense, Trey Parker and Matt Stone were two young filmmakers who'd met at the University of Colorado. They were making short films, experimenting with animation styles, trying to figure out what they wanted to do with themselves. And in 1992, as a film school project, genuine coursework, not a pitch, not a prototype. They made a 4-minute animated short called Jesus vs. Frosty. It's not sophisticated work. It was made with physical construction paper and photographed with an old 8mm film camera. If you track it down and watch it now, you can see the edges of the paper, the slight shake of the frame, the rough cut quality of something made with no budget and no particular expectation that anyone outside a classroom would ever see it. But here's the thing. If you know South Park, you'd recognize elements of it immediately. There are 4 small figures, paper cutouts, elementary school age, standing together. One of them is noticeably rounder than the others. His name in this version is Kenny. The short involves Frosty the Snowman coming to life and being confronted by Jesus, with the boys watching the chaos unfold around them. It was a class assignment. Nobody outside Parker and Stone's immediate circle was supposed to see it. That is the actual origin of South Park. Not the pilot episode, not the network deal. 2 students making a Christmas horror comedy for a film class in Colorado. 3 years later, in 1995, things shifted. A man named Brian Graydon was working at Fox. He'd somehow encountered Jesus versus Frosty. Exactly how it reached him is slightly murky, a matter of who passed what to whom in those pre-internet days of tape, sharing, and festival screenings, and he liked what Parker and Stone were doing. The sensibility, the willingness to go somewhere absurd with a straight face. He paid them $1,000 to make a new short. Not a pilot, not a development project. An animated video Christmas card that he could dub onto VHS tapes and send to his friends and colleagues at the holidays. They made Jesus versus Santa. It was slightly more polished than the 1992 version, a bit more confident, a bit more self-aware about its own absurdism. The same 4 boys were in the background. Graydon copied it onto tapes and sent it out. And then, in the way that things occasionally happened in the last years before the internet truly took over, those tapes started multiplying. People were dubbing them and passing them along. Someone started digitizing them. Someone else started posting the files in early internet spaces. In 1995, with no social media, no YouTube, no mechanism for viral distribution as we now understand it, this little construction paper animation became, by the standards of the time, genuinely widespread. People were seeking it out, passing it around, finding it funny in the way you find something funny when it feels like it wasn't supposed to exist. Fox was interested. Comedy Central was interested. Both networks had seen what was circulating and understood that there was an audience forming around this material. And Fox was, for a stretch of time, the closer prospect. There were conversations. There was what Parker and Stone have described as genuine development interest. But Fox had notes. The notes were, in essence, instructions to make the show softer, cleaner, more accessible to a broader audience. The specific feedback, as Parker and Stone have described it over the years, amounted to a request to produce something you could schedule adjacent to mainstream programming without unsettling the advertisers. Something less confrontational, something that maintained the surface energy of what they were doing, while removing the parts that made it actually challenging. Parker and Stone weren't interested in that version of the show. Not because they were being difficult or precious about their vision, though maybe a little of that, but because the whole point of what they were making was that it was unfiltered. The sensibility that made Jesus versus Frosty funny in that film class was exactly the sensibility that Fox's notes would have removed. You couldn't make that concession and keep the thing. Comedy Central picked it up instead. And that decision, Fox's hesitation, Comedy Central's willingness, turned out to matter in ways that probably nobody in that negotiation fully understood. When South Park premiered in August 1997, Comedy Central had roughly 46 million subscribers, die beers. Within approximately a year of the show's arrival, that number had grown to around 50 million households. South Park didn't just improve Comedy Central's ratings, it transformed the network's identity, its subscriber base, its cultural position. The show built Comedy Central into something people were actively seeking out and paying to access. The pilot episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, which is genuinely one of the great unintentional series premiere titles in the history of television, was the only episode of the show ever made using actual physical construction paper and traditional stop-motion photography. Every episode that followed used computers programmed to replicate the look of paper cutouts, but that first one is a real physical object. Real P, the pilot episode, was made with real construction paper cutouts, rafts. It took 3 months to complete, 3 months for a single 22-minute episode, using a process that the show would eventually compress to 6 days. I find something oddly compelling about that. There is a physical artifact from the origin of one of the longest-running animated series in American television history. Somewhere, probably in storage at South Park Studios in Culver City, California, there are actual construction paper cutouts that were used to make that pilot. Not digital files, not hard drives, not archived physical things made from paper when you're animating with construction paper. The characters that have been rendered millions of times in computer animation over nearly 30 years started as pieces of card that someone cut with scissors. And then there's the detail about where the visual style itself came from. Parker and Stone have cited Terry Gilliam's cutout animations from Monty Python's Flying Circus as the aesthetic inspiration for the show's look. The deliberately rough, jerky, two-dimensional style that makes South Park look like something a child produced on a slow Sunday afternoon. They wanted it to look like that, not because they couldn't produce something more sophisticated, but because the roughness was part of the content's honesty. South Park was always a show about children, animated with the energy of children's craft projects, saying things no actual child should be allowed to say. The gap between the form and the content is part of the joke. One more thing from the origin story. The trajectory of that first season is still remarkable when you see the numbers. The premiere drew approximately 1 million viewers. By the 10th episode of season 1, the show had reached a Nielsen rating of 6.4. That is an arc of growth that most television shows never experience across their entire run, let alone within their first year. The show arrived and immediately became the thing people were talking about, the thing that teenagers were quoting to each other, the thing that parents disapproved of, and therefore the thing their children absolutely needed to see. All of it from a $1,000 Christmas card. Brian Graydon paid 2 University of Colorado graduates $1,000 to make a video Christmas card. And what came out of that eventually is a show that is still being made in 2025 with a renewal through 2030 and a production deal worth $1.5 billion. If there's a more South Park origin story anywhere in television history, I genuinely haven't found it. Now, let's talk about Kenny. Kenny McCormick is, on the surface, the simplest character in South Park. He's the poor kid, his family lives in a rundown house at the wrong end of town. The kind of house where the paint is peeling and something inside always sounds like it's about to break. His parents drink too much and fight too much and don't pay close enough attention to him. He wears an orange parka with the hood pulled so tight around his face that you can barely see his eyes. And when he speaks, his voice comes out so muffled by the fabric that you almost never make out exactly what he's saying. The muffling is the point. Kenny exists just slightly out of focus, present, recognizable, but never quite fully legible. And in the early years of South Park, the first 4 or 5 seasons, more or less, Kenny's defining characteristic was that he died constantly, creatively, with what you could only describe as an escalating enthusiasm on the part of the writers for inventing new methods. He'd be hit by a bus, struck by lightning, crushed by something large falling from an implausible height, eaten by something that had no business being in suburban Colorado. He'd spontaneously combust. He'd explode in ways that defied the laws of physics. He'd be stabbed or drowned or dropped into something terrible or struck by asteroids. The methods were varied to the point of becoming a running competition. How strange can it get this week? And after each death, Stan would say, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny." And Kyle would say, "You bastards." And then next episode, without explanation or acknowledgement, Kenny would be alive and present at the bus stop. Nobody noticed. Nobody mentioned it. It was just part of the furniture. For a very long time, this was treated as exactly what it appeared to be, a running gag. The joke was the repetition, the casualness of it, the total absence of consequence. Kenny dies. That's his thing. The show never explained it, and not explaining it was part of the point. In a show about the failure of adults to respond appropriately to anything, Kenny dying every episode and coming back without comment was a kind of satirical shorthand for how easily human beings normalize the abnormal. But then something changed. Around season 14, in a 3-part story arc called the Coon and Friends trilogy, the show did something quite unexpected. It began taking Kenny's situation seriously. Not in a way that abandoned the humor, this is still South Park, and humor is never entirely absent, but in a way that added genuine mythological depth to a character who had mostly functioned as a comedic device. And it started with a superhero. The boys form a superhero group. Most of the other boys have invented powers, abilities that are clearly pretend, costumes assembled from whatever was available. The kind of backyard heroism that seems entirely normal at age 9. But Kenny's superhero alter ego is Mysterion, and Mysterion is different from the others in a specific and unsettling way. His power is real. During these episodes, Kenny, wearing his Mysterion costume, stands in front of his friends and tells them plainly what he is. He says that he cannot die. He explains that he has been killed many, many times, that he always comes back, and that nobody, not his parents, not his closest friends, not anyone in his life, ever remembers it happening. They absorb the information and then it's gone. His friends don't believe him. They assume he's exaggerating, playing up his superhero persona, doing the thing that children do when they're play acting at being special. So Kenny, in a moment that lands very differently from anything you'd expect in a South Park episode, pulls out a gun and shoots himself in the head. Right in front of them, everyone is horrified. They're crying. They can't process what they've just watched. And then, the next morning, Kenny wakes up in his bed. He gets dressed, he walks to school, and not one of his friends has any memory of what happened. That scene, the specificity of it, the quiet desperation underneath the act, carries a kind of emotional weight that is genuinely unexpected from a show that built its reputation on shock humor. Because what the show is articulating very clearly is that the worst part of Kenny's situation isn't the dying. The dying is the surface. The real tragedy is the isolation. He suffers alone every single time. He experiences something that by any measure should be shared, should be witnessed, should matter to the people who love him, and it evaporates. He's the only person in the world who knows what's happening to him, and he can never make anyone else understand, because even when he shows them directly, they forget. And then the show goes further, because it actually provides an explanation for where the curse came from. Kenny goes to his parents. He confronts them about something called the Cult of Cthulhu. Cthulhu, from H.P. Lovecraft's mythology, the ancient cosmic entity that sleeps beneath the ocean, the incomprehensible horror at the edge of all human understanding, the thing that will one day rise and end everything. That Cthulhu, Kenny's parents, when confronted, admit that yes, they did attend a cult meeting. They joined a group dedicated to the worship of Cthulhu. They signed up willingly for a ritual connection to a cosmic horror. And the reason they joined? Free beer. That is the entire reason. Kenny's parents condemned their son to an eternity of dying and being reborn, completely alone in the knowledge of what's happening to him, trapped in a Lovecraftian nightmare that nobody else can perceive because there was free beer at the cult meeting. The beer was free. And that was enough. I genuinely don't know how to overstate how perfectly South Park that is. The Lovecraftian scale of the curse, ancient, cosmic, inescapable, measured against the absolute smallness of its origin. The gap between what was created and why it was created is so vast that it becomes funny. And then the funny flips back into something closer to tragedy. Because it means that everything terrible about Kenny's existence, all of that loneliness and pain and endless repetition, is rooted in a moment of ordinary human cheapness. His parents wanted something for free, and their son has been paying for it ever since. The trilogy ends with what I would describe as the most haunting scene South Park has ever produced, without much competition. Kenny has died again. He's been reborn again. His friends have forgotten again. And so he tells them he's tired, which reads in context as the understatement of a person who has been exhausted by this for years and says he wants to go to bed. Then he shoots himself in the head one more time. His friends are horrified, all over again, as if it's the first time. They'll forget by morning, they always do. The scene cuts to Kenny's house. His mother jolts awake in bed, clutching her stomach, scree. Then she's placing a newborn baby, who we understand will grow up to be Kenny, into a crib. Crib. She turns to her husband with something that reads as genuine, weary regret. We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting. That line changes everything about the show's history, not just for those specific episodes, retroactively for the entire run. Every Kenny death from the first 5 seasons, every moment where the episode cut to him being hit by a bus, or eaten, or falling from something, suddenly isn't just a gag. It's a tragedy that the audience was watching without understanding. The mythology was always there, waiting underneath the joke, patient, until the show decided to surface it. And once it's surfaced, you can't put it back. You watch those early episodes differently. There's a fan theory connected to the broader Kenny mythology that is, I'll say up front, unconfirmed and not denied, which is the standard territory for theories about a show that almost never explicitly confirms or denies anything. The theory involves Cartman. At some point in the show's history, Cartman received a corneal transplant using Kenny's eye. The theory argues that through this connection, Cartman has occasional fragmentary awareness of Kenny's situation. Not full knowledge, not the ability to remember Kenny's deaths consistently, but flashes, glimpses of something that shouldn't be accessible to him, which, if true, would explain some of Cartman's stranger and more inexplicable moments across the series. Times when he seems to know something he has no reason to know. Is this confirmed? No. Has it been denied? Also no. And then there's the season 6 detail, which rounds out the mythology nicely. In season 5, Kenny was killed off in what appeared to be a permanent way, not as a gag, but in an actual episode called Kenny Days, which played his terminal illness completely straight. It was a moving episode, treated with unusual sincerity. For the entirety of season 6, Kenny was absent, replaced essentially by Butters and briefly by another child named Tweak. When Kenny returned at the end of season 6, the show simply didn't explain it. He was just there again, alive at the bus stop, as if nothing had happened. At the time, that felt like a bit of convenient narrative hand-waving. The show needed Kenny back, so it brought him back. In retrospect, with the Coon and Friends mythology in place, it fits perfectly. Of course he came back. He always does. He always will. That's the curse. What I keep coming back to when I think about all of this is the specificity of the emotion. South Park is not a show known for emotional specificity. It's a show known for satire, for irreverence, for pushing things to their most absurd extremes. But the Kenny mythology is specific in a way that feels almost confessional. The loneliness of being the only person who knows something true. The exhaustion of being unable to share it. The way suffering becomes invisible when you're the only one who can see it. Whether that was always planned or arrived through the organic process of a long-running show, gradually discovering what its own characters mean, I don't think it matters. It's there. It's been there since the beginning in the character they chose to make the least legible, the one whose face you can never quite see, the one whose voice you can never quite understand. There is one more piece of the Kenny story worth holding on to because it complicates the mythology in an interesting way. The season 5 episode in which Kenny dies permanently, actually permanently, or so it appeared, is called Kenny Dies. It's one of the show's least typical episodes. The death isn't played for comedy. Cartman visits Kenny in the hospital and breaks down crying, an act of apparent genuine grief that the show treats with unusual seriousness, even as it later reveals that Cartman's motivations were not entirely pure. The other boys process the loss with something closer to actual sadness than the show typically allows. The whole episode has a different register from the standard South Park fare, and that tonal shift is part of what made the permanent death feel credible. And then Kenny was just back at the end of season 6. No explanation, no ceremony, just present again at the bus stop, as if the previous season's absence hadn't happened. At the time, this felt like a narrative convenience. The show had tried something, it hadn't quite worked, and it had quietly retreated. But once you know about the Cthulhu cult, once you understand the mechanism behind Kenny's situation, the lack of explanation is the most accurate thing the show could have done. There's no explanation that the other characters would retain. Kenny coming back is simply what happens. It has always been what happens. The show, in not explaining his return, was being more honest about Kenny's reality than any explanation could have been. The question of whether Kenny is aware of his own Cthulhu-derived situation in the earlier seasons before the Coon and Friends trilogy makes the mechanism explicit is something the show leaves genuinely open. Does Season 2 Kenny know? Does Season 4 Kenny understand what keeps happening to him? The later episodes imply he's carried this knowledge for a long time, that the exhaustion is accumulated rather than the early ones offer some guidance. Dance. And there's something quietly sad in that ambiguity, the possibility that this child has been living with this knowledge since before the audience knew about it, carrying it silently through every episode, dying week after week in the ordinary way of things, alone with the understanding of what his life actually is. Kenny might be the most important character in the whole show, not because he drives the most stories or appears the most or says the most memorable lines, but because he knows the truth. He's the one who is seen behind the curtain, and he can never tell anyone who will remember. That is the real tragedy of Kenny McCormick. Not the dying, the loneliness. South Park has always maintained, officially, that it has 4 main characters, an ensemble, no single lead. 4 boys of equal narrative importance, and the show exists in the space between them and the town around them. That's the position. That's been the position since 1997. Here's the thing though, the evidence suggests quite strongly otherwise. Eric Cartman, the loud, round-faced, magnificently self-regarding 4th member of the group, who lives with his permissive mother Leanne in a house she keeps unreasonably clean, and who has spent the show's entire run doing things that range from obnoxious to genuinely disturbing, has been the functional protagonist of South Park since approximately season 4 or 5. Not because the show announces it, not because the other characters diminish or fade out, but because when you look carefully at which characters' decisions generate the significant plots, which characters' actions have the most lasting consequences, and which character the show keeps returning to when it wants to say something genuinely complicated, the answer is almost always Cartman. The clearest single piece of evidence for this is one episode, Scott Tenorman Must Die, Season 5, Episode 4. It is the highest rated episode in the show's history on IMDb at 9.6 out of 10, the kind of score that gets attached to things people remember for decades. And what the episode does is both simple and quietly seismic. It reveals that Cartman is capable of genuine villainy, not cartoon villainy, not obnoxious child villainy, something darker and more considered than either of those. The setup is this: a boy named Scott Tenorman has humiliated Cartman and taken his money. Cartman's initial attempts at revenge are treated as comedy, increasingly elaborate schemes that backfire in increasingly humiliating ways. It reads in the early stages as a typical Cartman episode. He's going to try something stupid and fail at it. and there will be laughs along the way. But then Cartman executes his final plan. He engineers the deaths of Scott Tenorman's parents. He processes them. He serves them to Scott in a chili at a cook-off. And then, with Scott crying over the realization of what he has just eaten, Cartman begins to laugh. He has been waiting for this moment. He has been planning it with patience that, in a 9-year-old, is genuinely unsettling. And when the moment arrives, he savors it completely. That is not a punchline. It doesn't play as a punchline. It's a moment of real, cold-blooded villainy committed by an elementary school child. And the show doesn't walk it back, doesn't offer a redemptive beat, doesn't give Cartman a consequence that balances the ledger. He won. He did something monstrous to win. And winning was enough. The episode has an additional layer that the show doesn't announce or underline. It's revealed much later in season 14, years after the original episode, that Scott Tenorman's father, Jack Tenorman, was also Cartman's biological father. Cartman's mother had an affair with Jack Tenorman, which means that in executing his revenge, Cartman unknowingly murdered his own biological father and had his half-brother eat him in a bowl of chili. The show files this away quietly. It's not the centerpiece of the season 14 revelation. It arrives as a layer of additional information, a piece of context that reframes Scott Tenorman must die retroactively without the episode itself changing at all. You go back and watch it again, and it's the same episode, but you're watching it differently. From Scott Tenorman onward, Cartman's role in the show changes in a way that's difficult to reverse. He's no longer just an unpleasant child who says unpleasant things. He's a character the show is genuinely interested in as a moral study. What does it mean that this person exists? What does it mean that he's occasionally right about things, genuinely right in ways that complicate the easy reading of him as the obvious antagonist? What does it mean that he's frequently the most competent person in any given situation, and that he uses that competence in the most destructive directions imaginable? You can make the protagonist argument fairly concretely by just looking at where the show's significant arcs originate, from season 5 onward. The Imagination Land trilogy in season 11 begins with a bet between Cartman and Kyle, Cartman's side of the bet being the engine of the whole story. The Coon and Friends trilogy in season 14 is built around Cartman's jealousy toward Kenny's Mysterion persona. The PC Principal arc in season 19 involves Cartman among its central threads. The serialized season 20 arc involves Cartman and its central relationship story. The Scott Tenorman storyline resurfaces in season 14 with Cartman's parentage fully revealed. The most discussed episodes in virtually every stretch of the show's run tend to be Cartman episodes because Cartman episodes tend to be the ones where the show takes the biggest swings. Trey Parker has said in various interviews that Cartman is the most enjoyable character to write, which is worth sitting with for a moment. Parker writes the vast majority of South Park. He's credited on 325 of the show's episodes, compared to Matt Stone's 28. If Cartman is Parker's favorite and Parker writes almost everything, then Cartman gets the richest material almost automatically. That's not exactly a conspiracy. It's just a structural fact about how the show works. But it does mean that the character's centrality isn't accidental. It was cultivated over years by the writer who loves writing him most. There's something else worth noting about what Cartman represents in the show's economy. South Park is a series that satirizes everything, every institution, every ideology, every piece of popular culture that crosses its path. It treats nothing as sacred and applies the same skeptical energy to every target. Cartman is the character who enacts that principle internally, within the fiction, without irony and without self-awareness. He does the things that the satire thinks about but can't quite commit to. He says the things that the show can only imply. He's the show's most honest voice in the most uncomfortable way. Whether this was always the plan is genuinely unclear. The season 1 Cartman is an obnoxious, spoiled child, rude and loud and self-centered. but essentially harmless in the way that demanding children are harmless. The Scott Tenorman Cartman is something qualitatively different. That evolution happened through individual episode decisions across several years, and at some point became irreversible. Once you've shown what a character is capable of, the audience carries that knowledge into everything that follows. The official position remains ensemble show, 4 main characters, no designated lead. But watching the show from its beginning and paying attention to where the weight sits, the other reading is very hard to avoid. Cartman is the protagonist. He has been for most of the show's run. The show just never said so out loud. And honestly, that's quite a South Park thing to do. There's one more layer worth adding here. The show's most acclaimed episodes are disproportionately Cartman episodes. Scott Tenorman Must Die sits at 9.6 on IMDb. The Imagination Land trilogy, driven by Cartman's bet with Kyle, produced the show's only Emmy win for Outstanding Animated Program in the feature-length category. The Coon and Friends arc, built around Cartman's jealousy, is widely regarded as some of the richest mythology the show ever produced. Even episodes that seem to be about something else often have Cartman at their structural core, shaping events from just off-center. What's interesting about that track record is that it isn't accidental. Parker writes toward Cartman the way a novelist returns to their most complex character, because the complexity is where the most interesting things happen. Cartman can be wrong in ways that are more interesting than other characters being right. He can want things that other characters can't want. He can cross lines that illuminate something about where the lines are and why they exist. That's a genuinely valuable function in a piece of satire. He's not just the villain, he's the show's pressure test. Whether he was always meant to become the central or whether the show discovered his value through use, I think the honest answer is probably the second one. Cartman in Season 1 is a much simpler entity than Cartman in Season 5 or Season 14. The character was extended and deepened through individual episode decisions made over years, each one adding a layer that the next one could build on. By the time Scott Tenorman aired, the writers knew what they had. After it, they knew even more clearly. And the show went in the direction of that knowledge. Here's the complication to everything we just talked about. By around Season 22, Cartman was losing the position. Not to Stan, not to Kyle, not to Kenny, to Randy Marsh, Stan's father, the geologist. The middle-aged supporting character who spent the first decade of the show mostly standing in the background of family scenes, reacting to his son's adventures, and occasionally doing something embarrassing that resolved itself by the end of the episode. Randy Marsh is now, by most reasonable measures, the functional main character of South Park, and the transition happened so gradually and so quietly that a large portion of the audience didn't fully register it until it was already complete. The shift has roots that go back earlier than the Tranquillity Farms era, though that's where it becomes undeniable. Randy had always been a reliable source of comedy. His episodes were popular. His absurdism had a particular flavor that distinguished it from the boys' stories. Where Cartman's comedy is cold and strategic, Randy's tends to be warm and self-defeating. He's a middle-aged man with a genuinely inflated sense of his own significance, who keeps throwing himself into situations he can't handle with the full confidence of someone who believes he can. He causes chaos while sincerely believing he's doing the right thing. Viewers responded to him, and the writers responded to that response. From mid-seasons onward, Randy's role grew steadily. Guitar Queero in Season 11, where he becomes obsessed with a music video game. Whale Whores in Season 13, where he becomes a professional whale hunter in Japan in response to a tragedy, for reasons that make complete sense in the moment if you're Randy. You're Getting Old in Season 15, which is a different kind of Randy episode entirely and deserves some attention. Season 15, Episode 7. You're Getting Old. Stan turns 10. and he develops a condition where everything he perceives, every piece of music, every film, every conversation, sounds and looks like literal excrement. The more enthusiastically something is presented to him, the more clearly it registers as garbage. The episode ends without the usual South Park reset. Randy and Sharon separate. Stan goes to live with his mother. The friendship group is fragmenting. The whole thing is played with a sincerity and a bleakness that was unusual enough at the time to generate genuine discussion about what the show was trying to say. The general interpretation, unconfirmed, not denied, consistent with what Parker has said in adjacent contexts, is that You're Getting Old is Trey Parker working through real creative disillusionment on screen. Stan's inability to find anything genuinely good is, in this reading, Parker's own exhausted relationship with popular culture at that particular moment. The sense that everything has started to feel like the same recycled energy in different packaging. The following episode walks some of it back. The marriage is repaired, the friendships resume. But not entirely. There's a note of unresolved weariness that the show carries forward, and you can feel it most clearly in how Randy is written from that point on. Because here's what I find interesting about Randy's trajectory. The things that make him complicated are adult things. His ego, his restlessness, his relationship to relevance, and to the question of what it means to have a certain kind of success and still feel like something is missing. His tendency to identify with trends and cultural movements in ways that are embarrassing to his family, but that he finds completely sincere. These are not the concerns of a child, and they're not the concerns of a satirical caricature. They're the concerns of a person. Beginning in season 22, Randy buys a marijuana farm in rural Colorado, and the show enters what has been called the Tegrity Farms era. It becomes a multi-season serialized arc in which Randy's cannabis empire is one of the show's primary narrative engines. The boys are not absent during these seasons, but they are, for substantial stretches, secondary. The show that began as 4 kids at a bus stop is now, in meaningful and extended ways, a show about a middle-aged man and his business decisions. Trey Parker has acknowledged in various interviews that Randy evolved autobiographically. The logic, as I understand it, is fairly straightforward. Parker wrote Stan as a version of himself as a child. As Parker got older, Stan stopped reflecting where Parker actually was. Randy, the adult, the parent, the person navigating middle age in a culture that keeps changing faster than he can process, started to. And Randy's specific combination of genuine good intentions and spectacular self-defeat, his relationship to ambition and relevance and what it means to be a creative person getting older, is recognizably personal in a way that goes beyond generic satire. What I find genuinely interesting about the shape of all this is that South Park has changed its main character twice without announcing either change. First, from an ensemble to Cartman, driven by the logic of which character produces the best stories. Then from Cartman to Randy, driven by the logic of which character the writer has become. Neither shift was acknowledged, neither was explained. The show just followed its own internal momentum, and the audience followed. That is actually a very South Park way to handle it. The show that has always refused to take things too seriously about itself also apparently refuses to make formal declarations about its own identity. It just keeps going, and if the center of gravity has shifted, so be it. You catch up when you catch up. One more thing worth noting about Randy's centrality in the later seasons. It changed the show's relationship to its own satire in an interesting way. When the boys were the primary lens, South Park's targets tended to be external, institutions, celebrities, political movements, cultural trends. The comedy came from the children's reasonable reactions to an unreasonable world. But when Randy became the primary lens, the target shifted inward. Randy is often the thing being satirized. He's the liberal with blind spots, the progressive who causes harm while believing he's doing good, the middle-aged man who thinks he understands the moment better than he does. The show, by making Randy its center, made itself the target in a way it hadn't been before. That's a genuinely interesting creative move. South Park had always been willing to satirize everything outside itself. The Tigridy Farms era represents, in some ways, the show satirizing the version of itself that got comfortable with its own success. The thing that happens to creative people when they've been celebrated long enough to start believing the celebration. Whether that reading is what Parker intended, or whether it's what the work means, regardless of intent, that's a different question, and one the show deliberately leaves. Standard animated sitcoms take somewhere between 6 and 12 months to produce a single episode. I sewed. From initial concept through final delivery, writing, storyboarding, voice recording, animation, editing, scoring, all of it. 8 to 9 months. That's the industry standard. That's how long it takes to make animated television properly. South Park does it in 6 days. This is not a loose approximation or a creative exaggerate. South Park's production schedule is usually around 6 days. The cycle begins on Thursday morning when the South Park writers start drafting the script for that week's episode, ISO-D. By Wednesday evening of the following week, a completed episode is transmitted via satellite uplink to Comedy Central, ready for broadcast at 10 p.m. that night. Sometimes the episode arrives at the network just hours before it airs. The window between "this episode doesn't exist" and "this episode is on television" is 6 days. Approximately 70 people are involved in making this happen: animators, sound engineers, editors, voice artists, production coordinators. During the production week, work hours regularly run to 100 or 120 hours. The studio operates at a near 24/7 pace during each 6-day production cycle. Goozily, sleep is rationed. Deadlines are not approximations. The creative consequence of the schedule is probably the most immediately obvious thing about how South Park differs from other animated shows. Because if you can produce an episode in 6 days, you can respond to the world in near real time. When major events happen, a political controversy, a cultural flashpoint, a news story that has captured the national attention, South Park can have an episode about it in days rather than months. The show has aired responses to events while those events were still being discussed. It has satirized things before other shows even began developing their respo. Osama bin Laden has farty pants. Aired in November 2001, about 2 months after September 11th, at a moment when most of popular culture was still genuinely unsure how or whether to engage with the event at all. South Park had an episode done. The 6-day model allowed that. It allows the show to be a genuine participant in the cultural conversation it's commenting on, rather than a delayed observer. But the schedule costs things. Not every cost is visible on screen, but they accumulate. Ideas get started and abandoned mid-week when they don't come together. Parker has described situations where he was rewriting the ending of an episode on Wednesday afternoon, actively, in real time, while the animation team was still completing the earlier scenes based on a version of the script that no longer existed. The team works from moving targets. The episode that gets delivered to Comedy Central on Wednesday night is sometimes substantially different from the episode that existed in outline form on Thursday morning. There is a documentary about this, 6 Days to Air, which premiered in 2011 on Comedy Central, follows the production of the season 15 premiere. Watching it is a genuinely strange experience if you go in with any assumptions about how professional television gets made. Parker's visibly exhausted throughout, writing in real time, talking himself through decisions out loud, occasionally appearing genuinely uncertain about what the episode is about while he's in the middle of writing it. At one point in the documentary, it's unclear whether the episode has a third act. This is on a Wednesday. The episode airs that night. The chaos is not performed. It's not a creative process myth or a production company brand. It is what the production looks like when you watch it happen. And somehow, out of that controlled and ongoing emergency, something coherent emerges every week. The show has had failures of the Shea power outage, delayed the 4th episode of season 17 in 2013. Production crises have occasionally pushed delivery to the last possible moment in ways that required Comedy Central to extend broadcasting windows. And in September 2025, during the production of season 27, Parker and Stone missed a deadline entirely and issued a public statement. The statement said, "Apparently when you do everything at the last minute, sometimes you don't get it done." That statement is notable for a specific reason. The show had been running the 6-day cycle for over 2 decades at that point. The acknowledgement that it failed, that the machine broke down, even briefly, landed differently than it might have from a show with a more conventional production schedule. It was an admission that the tightrope they've been walking for 25 years is still a tightrope. And then there are the episodes that never made it at all. These are distinct from the episodes that were pulled for content reasons. Those have their own section. I'm talking about episodes that were started and abandoned during production. Concepts that reached partial script stage and collapsed. Ideas that seemed workable on Thursday morning and were clearly not working by Friday afternoon and had to be set aside in favor of something else. Parker has referenced in various interviews the existence of work that never made it through. Incomplete things, discarded things, the creative casualties of a process that demands you commit and deliver within a very narrow window. These are the show's true lost episodes. Not censored, not banned, not withheld, just unfinished, swallowed by the pace of the machine. What I find genuinely fascinating about the 6-day model, and I'll admit this is the kind of thing you can find yourself thinking about at 1 a.m. when you should probably just go to sleep, is the paradox of it. South Park is studied seriously. It's won multiple Emmy Awards. It's been written about in academic contexts, discussed as a significant piece of cultural commentary compared favorably to classical satire. And it's made under conditions that would be considered irresponsible for almost any other creative endeavor. The show that is treated with considerable intellectual seriousness is also the show being assembled in a state of semi-permanent exhaustion, with the ending sometimes being written while the beginning is already animated. Maybe the pressure is the point. When you have 6 days and no more, you can't afford to overthink anything. You have to go with the first true idea, commit to it, and get it done. There's something in that constraint that produces a kind of instinctive honesty. The jokes land because they were made fast. The satire cuts because there wasn't time to soften it. The show has a quality of directness that more carefully produced work sometimes loses. Or maybe Parker and Stone are just very, very good at what they do, and the schedule is incidental. Both things are probably true at once. Here's a fun detail that doesn't get mentioned enough in discussions about the production process. The show's entire archive of pre-2009 episodes was eventually re-rendered in high definition. Seasons 1 through 12 were originally produced in standard definition in 4:3 aspect ratio, the squarish television format that was the norm until widescreen became standard. When the show switched to native HD production starting with season 13 in 2009, the earlier episodes suddenly looked dramatically different from the newer ones on modern screens. The solution was extraordinary in its own low-key way. Rather than simply upscaling the old footage, which would have looked blurry and stretched, the way old standard definition content looks when you force it into a widescreen frame, South Park Studios went back to the original archived Maya and Alias Power Animator scene files, the actual 3D models and scene data that were used to produce those episodes originally. And they re-rendered the entire pre-HD archive from scratch, in full 1080p and widescreen. This is possible because South Park's digital production pipeline archived the source files, not just the final output. The episodes look genuinely clean in HD because they were actually remade from original assets, not digitally stretched. This is the kind of thing that sounds boring and technical until you consider what it means. There's a sense in which the pre-2009 episodes you watch on streaming today are not the episodes as they originally aired. They're new renders made from the same source material, but produced with more recent technology. The 1997 episodes have been remade in a specific technical sense for the screens you're watching them on. The show has been quietly, continuously updated in ways that most viewers never register. That feels very South Park to me, actually, the continuous revision. The refusal to leave the archive exactly as it was. There are 5 episodes of South Park that you cannot watch on major streaming platforms. They've been removed from official streaming, pulled from syndication, and in some cases have not been legally available in any complete or accurate form for well over a decade. All 5 involve the same thing: the depiction of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. I want to be careful about how I frame this because it's genuinely complicated territory, and I think it deserves more than a simple "the show got censored" summary. The full story is strange in specific ways that don't resolve neatly. The first time Muhammad appeared on South Park was in 2001. The episode is called Super Best Friends, Season 5, Episode 3. The premise is that a team of religious figures, each operating as a superhero type, come together to face a threat. Jesus is there, Buddha is there, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, Seaman, and Muhammad, depicted visually, presented as a member of the G. The episode aired on July 4th, 2001, pre-September 11th, in a completely different cultural moment. It received decent reviews, went into syndication, and was, for several years, simply a South Park episode. Nothing was pulled, nobody issued formal objections, it circulated normally. That's the baseline. Muhammad appearing in South Park was not, in 2001, an incident. 5 years later, in 2006, the context had changed substantially. In September 2005, a Danish newspaper had published cartoons depicting Muhammad that had sparked significant protests and violent responses across multiple countries. The question of whether media could or should depict the prophet had become genuinely charged. South Park, which had never avoided charged territory, decided to engage with it directly. Cartoon Wars, Parts 1 and 2, Season 10. The episode's premise involves another animated show, a clear stand-in for Family Guy, planning to air a depiction of Muhammad. The debate in the episode is explicitly about whether artistic freedom includes the right to depict religious figures that others consider sacred, and whether choosing not to depict one figure while depicting all others represents a form of editorial cowardice. Parker and Stone wanted to air the depiction of Muhammad uncensored. Comedy Central refused. A black bar was inserted over the relevant scene, Muhammad obscured behind a graphic, his presence signaled but not shown. The episode aired with this censorship in place. Here's the thing that gives the Cartoon Wars episodes their particular sharpness. The episode is partly about this exact thing. The plot debates whether a network should be allowed to censor a cartoon to avoid offending a religious group. Comedy Central inserted a censor bar while that debate was being had on screen. The argument the show was making and the act of censoring it occurred simultaneously in the same broadcast on the same night. The meta-commentary composed itself without anyone having to write it. Then came Season 14 in 2010, episodes 200 and 201. 200 was the show's 200th episode, a significant milestone that the creators decided to mark in a very South Park way, by bringing back essentially every real-world person and every major controversy the show had ever engaged with in one enormous episode. It was a celebration and a catalog, a revisiting of 20 years of satire compressed into a single story. Muhammad appeared again, initially hidden inside a bear costume, visible but obscured, his presence present, but his image technically not shown. 201 continued the story. And that's where things became genuinely serious. A radical organization posted what was widely interpreted as credible threats targeting Trey Parker and Matt Stone specifically. The threats referenced the murder of a filmmaker who had been killed years earlier over work that was perceived as insulting to Islam. Comedy Central, in response, made the decision to add heavy audio censorship and extensive visual blurring to 201. not just around Muhammad, around an extended spoken monologue that had nothing to do with Muhammad, a monologue that delivered what Parker and Stone described as the episode's central argument about free expression. The speech was bleeped out completely, replaced with tones. And this happened without Parker and Stone's knowledge. They didn't consent to it. They didn't know it was being done until they saw the broadcast. Their response was measured but unambiguous. They issued a statement describing their disappointment. They characterized Comedy Central's choice as one made out of fear, and observed that the episode had been trying to make an argument about exactly that kind of capitulation. And the network had demonstrated the argument while attempting to suppress it. 201 has never been officially rerun. It has never been released in its complete, unedited form. The version that exists in official archives, on DVDs, on streaming in markets where it appears at all, is the censored broadcast version with the bleeps in the obscuring graphics in P. The original cut exists somewhere, presumably in Comedy Central's production archive, and has never been officially released eased. 200 was nominated for an Emmy Award. The Outstanding Animated Program category, which means the Television Academy had to take some active steps to view an episode that wasn't freely accessible in order to nominate it. South Park received a prestigious industry recognition for a censored, partially unavailable piece of work. Super Best Friends, the 2001 episode that had aired without incident for 9 years, was retroactively pulled from syndication and online streaming following the 201 controversy. Not because of anything new in the episode itself, but because its existence had become a liability in a changed context. The Cartoon Wars episodes were also removed. 5 episodes total, removed from the standard viewing archive. Parker and Stone's consistent position across all of this and in every interview that touches the subject has been this: the decision to treat Muhammad differently from every other religious figure, from Jesus, from Buddha, from Joseph Smith, all of whom South Park has depicted, criticized, and lampooned over the years, is itself a form of unequal treatment. If the principle is that satire applies equally to all institutions and all beliefs, then carving out one exception based on the threat of violence is not a principled position. It is a capitulation. Whether you agree with that argument or not, what's interesting about the 5 missing episodes is what they represent as a pattern. The show that satirizes everything has, in a specific and permanent way, been shaped by something external. The archive has a gap. There are things in the history of South Park that you cannot access through official channels, not because of what they contain, but because of what happened when they were broadcast. The gap is itself a kind of evidence. Here's one more thing about those 5 episodes that's worth noting because I think it's easy to miss in the broader controversy. The show has satirized every major religion that crossed its path across its entire run. Christianity has taken enormous hits. Jesus appears as a recurring character and is depicted in ways that vary from admiring to deeply unflattering. Judaism, Buddhism, Mormonism, Catholicism, Hinduism, all of them have been targets. Some of them multiple times. None of those episodes were pulled. None generated death threats that affected Comedy Central's broadcast decisions. The treatment of those religions, however pointed, was absorbed as part of the normal business of the show. The 5 missing Muhammad episodes are the only place in the show's catalog where external pressure, not network taste, not audience feedback, not evolving standards, permanently altered what's available to watch. And that fact is itself the argument that 200 and 201 were trying to make. The episodes about unequal treatment proved unequal treatment was real by experiencing it. That's a strange kind of evidence, but it's evidence nonetheless. Parker and Stone have said that comedy dies when it has to apply different rules to different subjects. That the moment you establish one group that's off limits, you've compromised the principle that makes satire work. Whether you agree with that position or not, and reasonable people disagree, the 5 missing episodes are the most concrete demonstration of what they were arguing. The gap in the archive is the argument made visible. Let's slow down for a moment. We've been in fairly heavy territory, censorship, death threats, a show's creative output being altered without its creator's knowledge or consent. That's not nothing. It's the kind of material that sits with you a bit, and I think it's worth just letting it settle before we move on. The room is probably quiet by now. It's late, wherever you are. Maybe some of what we've talked about has already started to blur into the background, parts of the evening going soft at the edges while other parts stay vivid. That's fine. That's exactly the right state of mind for what comes next. Because the next thing I want to talk about is a bit more personal, less geopolitics, less network decision-making, something closer to the human center of the show. A man who worked on South Park for almost a decade, who brought something warm and genuine to what can be a fairly relentless show, and what happened when he left, and what Parker and Stone did next. Jerome McElroy, chef, was South Park Elementary's cafeteria cook, and he had been there since the very beginning, voiced by Isaac Hayes, the soul and R&B musician from Season 1 in 1997 through Season 9 in 2006. Approximately 136 to 150 episodes. Nearly a decade of being the one adult in South Park who, more often than not, gave the boys something resembling reasonable advice. Chef was warm. That's the simplest way to describe what he brought to the show. In a fictional town populated almost entirely by irresponsible, self-interested, or actively harmful adults, parents who fail their children, authority figures who create the problems they're supposed to solve, neighbors who are reliably terrible, Chef was the exception. He was the adult who engaged with the boys as actual human beings, who listened, who sometimes gave them genuine guidance wrapped in a style that was distinctly his own. He wasn't perfect. This is South Park. Nobody is. But he had a warmth that the show didn't have many other sources for. Isaac Hayes had won a Grammy Award before taking the role. He had a long and substantial career in music, with Shaft among the most recognizable pieces of music in popular culture. He was a serious artist who chose to do a cartoon, and he did it well, and the character became one of the show's most beloved recurring figures. Hayes was also a practicing Scientologist. South Park had satirized Scientology before Chef's departure. The show had always applied the same irreverent analysis to religious institutions that it applied to everything else. In 2005, Season 9, Episode 12, Trapped in the Closet. The episode depicted the actual theological claims of Scientology using content drawn from leaked internal church documents, presenting them within the show's satirical frame. Tom Cruise appeared in a wardrobe. John Travolta appeared in the same ward parody of R. Kelly appeared in Trapped in the Closet. B. R. Kelly sang about it. The episode was widely discussed and generated significant press coverage. It's one of the show's most talked about individual episodes. Isaac Hayes was a Scientologist. He worked on the show through the end of Season 9. He gave no statement when Trapped in the Closet aired. He continued voicing Chef through 2 more episodes after it. And then, in January 2006, he issued a resignation statement. The statement said he was leaving South Park due to the show's inappropriate ridicule of people's religious beliefs. He expressed pride in what the show had achieved and said he had enjoyed his time on it, but that he could no longer be part of content that mocked people's faith. Parker and Stone issued their own response. Their point was direct. Hayes had worked on South Park for 9 years, during which the show had satirized every major religion it could find: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Mormonism, Catholicism. The show had run episodes that depicted all of these traditions with the same irreverent energy. Hayes had been there for all of it. He had never raised an objection. His objection arrived specifically when the religion being satirized was his own. That inconsistency, in Parker and Stone's view, was the story. There is a second layer to Hayes' departure that lives in less certain territory. Reports from people close to Hayes at the time indicated that he had suffered a stroke in January 2006, around the period of his resignation. Some accounts suggested the stroke had significantly impaired his faculties in ways that affected his ability to process and communicate. There have been suggestions, not confirmed, not conclusively denied, that the resignation statement may not have been initiated by Hayes himself, or may not have fully reflected his own position. Whether the departure was entirely his own decision, made from a position of full capacity, is something that has never been resolved publicly. What that possibility adds to the story, if it's true, is a dimension of genuine sadness that the public narrative mostly obscured. The controversy was about Scientology and creative principles. But underneath that, there may have been a man whose ability to speak for himself had been compromised, whose departure from a show he'd worked on for nearly a decade was being managed by others. Parker and Stone handled the departure in the only way that was consistent with who they are and what the show is. They brought Chef back in the season 10 premiere specifically to kill him, but not with new voice recordings. Hayes was gone. So they built his final performance by splicing together fragments of his existing audio, real Hayes recordings from previous episodes, rearranged into new sentences that Chef had never actually said. If you listen to those scenes carefully, the rhythm is slightly off. The sentences have an assembled quality. The words are Hayes' voice, but the delivery is a patch job. The death itself was extreme even by South Park standards, which is saying something. Chef was mauled by a mountain lion, stabbed, shot, fell from a cliff, caught fire. The show committed to it with a thoroughness that felt purposeful. And then, as the boys gathered around Chef's body to deliver a eulogy, his corpse was possessed by the Super Adventure Club, a cult organization that functioned as an explicit analog for Scientology, and stood up. Chef became, in his final moments, the villain. A good person whose goodness had been co-opted and overridden by an organization that had claimed him. It was the most editorial thing Parker and Stone had ever done in the show's fiction. The most direct use of the show's narrative as a response to something that had happened in the real world. Chef, a villain, was a statement about cult influence. The message was not coded. Stan's eulogy for Chef in that episode is played genuinely straight. He talks about loving Chef, about how the real Chef, the man they knew, the man who helped them, was not the thing that the Super Adventure Club made him into. About remembering the person before the transformation. For a show that almost never plays things entirely straight, that commitment to real feeling in the middle of such a pointed editorial response is striking. The anger and the grief are both present. The satire is the anger, the eulogy is the grief. What I come back to with Chef's story is this. He was the warmest, recurring presence in a show that is not generally warm. A voice of genuine care in an environment of sustained chaos. His absence left a specific kind of hole that the show has never really filled. Because the show never tried to fill it, it just acknowledged the loss and moved on, which is perhaps the most honest thing it could have done. Something worth sitting with, maybe. And here's one more Chef detail, which I think is underappreciated in the broader discussions of his departure. Chef's relationship to music wasn't incidental to the character. Music was his primary mode of expression. When he had something important to say, he usually sang it. He'd break into soul ballads in the middle of conversations. He'd address the boys' problems through song, in the tradition of a musical form that has always been about processing difficult feelings through melody. The songs were funny, they were South Park, operating on multiple levels simultaneously, but they were also genuinely accomplished because Isaac Hayes was a genuinely remarkable musician, and he brought that to the character even in the most absurd contexts. That combination, musical warmth and genuine guidance, is something no other character in the show has ever replicated. The hole left by Chef's departure is a very specific shape, and South Park has never tried to fill it with anything else. It just acknowledged a loss and kept going, which is actually probably the most honest response available. South Park has a character who has been part of the show since around season 4. He goes to school with the main boys, lives in the same neighborhood, appears in episodes across the show's entire run. He plays bass guitar. His family is noticeably wealthier than most of the other children's families. He is South Park's only prominent black student character. And for approximately 20 years, his name was spelled, in all official materials, episode credits, merchandise, the show's own website, as Token Black. Token, as in the token black character. As in the television industry practice of including a single representative of a demographic group in an otherwise homogeneous cast. Not because the writers have anything meaningful to do with the character, but because the absence of anyone from that demographic would be conspicuous. South Park was naming the trope directly, explicitly in the character's given name. The joke was announced in the credits. This is Token, he is the token, we know, we're aware. Ha! It was meta-commentary, in the particular South Park mode of making uncomfortable things visible by making them into the joke. The show does this constantly. Rather than pretend that a problematic thing isn't present, it names it at high volume and dares you to decide how you feel about the naming. Whether that's a sophisticated form of critique or just giving yourself plausible deniability about the thing you're doing is a question that South Park has always left open. And then in 2022, in an episode called Japanese Toilets, the character's name was changed, or rather, and this is where it gets interesting, the show declared that his name had never been Token. It had always been Tolkien, as in J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. His parents had named him after Tolkien because they were fans of the books. The Token interpretation had been a misreading, a 20-year collective mistake, a long mispronunciation of a name that had always meant something else entirely. That's the retcon. And it is, I think, worth unpacking carefully because it does several things simultaneously. On the most straightforward level, it's a course correction. Token Black, the joke name, the explicit acknowledgement of the tokenism trope, the bit that names its own function, is a piece of writing that lands differently in 2022 than it did in 2000. The cultural temperature around representation in media had shifted in ways that made the joke sit less comfortably. Changing the name to Tolkien was an acknowledgement of that, an attempt to give the character a name that was his rather than a name that described his purpose in the show. On another level, though, the execution is distinctly South because Token and Tolkien are not homonyms, not onyms. They sound identical when spoken aloud. The character in every episode before and after the name change is referred to by a name that sounds like Token. If you're watching rather than reading, nothing has changed. The original joke is preserved underneath the surface of the correction, still there, still audible, just now deniably something else. If you want to read the name change as sincere, it's available as sincere. If you want to read it as a South Park joke about the act of making corrections that don't actually change anything, that reading is also fully available. Both interpretations coexist in the same two syllables, which is honestly quite a sophisticated piece of ambiguity to hide inside what looks like a simple course correction. Adrian Beard, who voices Tolkien, is one of the show's production supervisors and has been part of the team for a long time. He's Black. He has been voicing the character since approximately season 4. Whether the name change was something he initiated, whether it came from a conversation with him, or whether it was a decision made independently, Parker and Stone haven't discussed the process publicly. That silence is interesting in its own way. The show often explains its choices loudly and at length. The choice not to explain this one is notable. Fan response was genuinely divided. Some people found the change sincere and appropriate. Some found it uncomfortable, a correction that technically didn't change the sound of the name, only the spelling, which made it feel like an adjustment designed to appear responsible without actually being costly. And some people assumed, in the most South Park reading possible, that the whole thing was a joke about the way institutions changed names and spellings to seem more progressive while leaving the underlying structure intact. Here's the thing, I don't think any of those readings is wrong. They're probably all partly right. The show has been doing this kind of layered, both things at once commentary for its entire run. The Tolkien token thing is unusual, mainly because this time the subject of the commentary is the show itself. What makes this interesting as a conspiracy, in the loosest, most casual sense of the word, is that it was hiding in plain sight for so long. The name wasn't a subtle Easter egg or an obscure reference. It was in the credits of every episode the character appeared in. It was stated out loud by other characters on screen. It was on official merchandise. Thousands of people watched those credits roll for 20 years and read Token Black and either got the joke or didn't, without questioning what was underneath it. And then, when the question finally got asked officially, the answer turned out to be, his name was always something else. Whether you believe that or not is up to you. The South Park theme is performed by Primus, recorded at 140 BPM in 4 tucker time per time. If you've seen more than a few episodes of the show, you know the theme before I finish describing it. It's one of those pieces of music that embeds itself in the brain very efficiently and stays there. I've had it stuck in my head for days at a stretch without being able to explain why, which is possibly Les Claypool's greatest achievement. What most people don't know is how many versions of it have existed across the show's run, and what those versions contain. The original theme, the one that played from Season 1 through approximately the middle of Season 4, featured call and response vocals between Claypool and the 4 boys. Claypool would sing his verse, and then the boys would respond. It was bouncy and slightly chaotic in a way that matched the show's energy perfectly. One small detail worth knowing. During Season 3, the boys' vocal contributions were re-recorded at a slightly higher pitch. Not because anything was wrong with the originals, but because the characters had aged slightly within the show's logic, and it seemed right to adjust. Nobody announced this. If you watch Season 1 episodes and then Season 3 episodes back to back, you can hear the difference if you're listening carefully, but most people absorbed it without noticing. Then the 4th grade theme arrived, mid-Season 4. A techno and breakbeat remix produced by a musician named Paul Robb, which replaced the acoustic guitar backbone with something electronic and more propulsive. This one was noticeable enough that people mentioned it. The show sounded different, and people were right that at Season 6 through early 10 brought the bluegrass theme, twangy, countrified, with a warmth that sat somewhat oddly with the show's content, but worked in the way that unexpected genre choices sometimes do. From Season 10 onward, the Wamola theme, a rock and metal remix featuring Claypool's Wamola, which is a custom electric bass instrument he built himself, a string contraption that produces a sound somewhere between a cello and an electric guitar. The Wamola theme is probably the one most people think of as the show's definitive sound. The one that plays in your head when someone says South Park. There's one version that stands apart from the rest. Season 25, 2022. South Park produced an orchestral re-recording of the theme, a full orchestra, the most elaborate and expensive version of the theme ever produced, presumably in part to mark the show's longevity and continued ambitions. And this version, for the first time, included Kenny's contribution to the song in its full, unobscured form. Throughout the show's run, every version, every season, Kenny's lines in the theme are muffled, exactly as his speaking voice is muffled by his parka hood in every episode. You can hear that he's contributing something. You can make out roughly the cadence and the rhythm of it. But the actual words have always been obscured, layered under his signature muffling effect. Indecipherable in the same way that everything Kenny says is indecipherable. Kenny's actual lyrics are extremely offensive. They appear to have been written that way from the beginning and simply buried under the audio effect for the entirety of the show's run. The Season 25 orchestral arrangement made them clearly audible for the first time. The response from people who finally heard them distinctly was largely a recognition that yes, this is entirely in keeping with Kenny's character, and also that the show had been hiding something quite specific in the opening credits for 25 years. Right there, every week. I'll be honest, when I first heard what Kenny was actually saying, my immediate reaction was that it was exactly what you would expect from a show that puts the most offensive possible thing into the least visible space on purpose for 2.5 decades, just to see if anyone noticed. That's a very long commitment to a bit. The season 6 detail is the one I find most quietly perfect. When Kenny was canonically dead for the entire season, following his apparent permanent death at the end of season 5, his lines in the theme song were not left empty or filled with silence. They were given to Timmy Birch. Timmy, whose defining characteristic is that he can only say his own name, contributed his lines to the theme as simply Timmy. This replacement was uncredited and unannounced. It was a small, quiet adjustment to reflect the in-universe situation. If you watch a season 6 episode and then go back to a season 5 episode and listen carefully to the theme, the change registers. Timmy in the space where Kenny was, muffled enthusiasm replaced by a child loudly announcing his own existence. And then there's the original pilot's tempo. The theme, as recorded for the first unaired version, was significantly slower than the broadcast version. Slower to the point where, apparently, it didn't work. The energy of the show and the energy of the theme weren't matching. The decision was made to speed it up. The broadcast version is the sped-up version, and it's what the show has always been. The slow version is a historical footnote, a version of the door you didn't walk through. The theme song is something worth thinking about as a piece of the show's larger identity. It's the one part of South Park that Trey Parker and Matt Stone didn't write or perform themselves. It was made by an outside artist, Primus, which is a very specific choice, not a generic television composer, and it's been the audience's entry point into the show for nearly 30 years. Every version of the theme signals something about what kind of show South Park was trying to be in that era. The bluegrass version is a different show from the Wamola version. The orchestral version is different from both. The theme has been quietly carrying the show's identity through its various phases. And underneath it all, for 25 years, there was Kenny saying something you couldn't hear. Leopold Stotch first appears in the background of the South Park pilot. He doesn't have a name. He doesn't have a voice. He's a generic third grader visible in the background of classroom scenes, one of several children that the animators placed there because classrooms contained more than 4 students and someone had to fill the seats. He was, in that first episode, entirely unremarkable, a prop. Over the course of seasons 3 and 4, he was gradually developed into a named, voiced character with a distinct personality. The voice, sweet, slightly formal, faintly bewildered, was created for him. The name Butters was given to him. And by season 5, when the decision was made to write Kenny off permanently, the production needed to figure out who would serve as the 4th core character in his absence. The answer was Butters. Looking back at that choice, it's remarkable how much it reveals about what the show was reaching toward. Because here's the thing about Butters, he is, in almost every meaningful sense, Kenny's opposite. Where Kenny is the passive victim of supernatural circumstances entirely beyond his control, condemned to die and be reborn by his parents' accidental affiliation with a cosmic horror, Butters is an active participant in his own difficulties. His problems aren't cosmic, they're relentlessly human. He's naive enough to be taken advantage of by people who should know better. He's trusting enough to keep extending good faith to people who consistently misuse it. He's optimistic enough to believe, against substantial evidence, that things will work out if he just tries his best. And he is, underneath all of that, genuinely kind. In a show where genuine kindness is quite rare, his parents are not good parents. His father, Stephen Stotch, grounds him constantly. Sometimes for situations Butters had nothing to do with. Sometimes for situations in which Butters was clearly the victim. The groundings are running gags, deployed with frequency and variety across many seasons. But they accumulate into something beyond comedy. They form a portrait of a child who has been conditioned over time to apologize for existing, who has learned that the response to being wronged is self-recrimination, who has internalized a sense of his own fault as a default position. And he remains, through all of it, consistently kind, not despite what's been done to him, not as a performance or a defense mechanism, just as a fact of his character. Butters has decided to be good, and he keeps deciding it in situations where nobody would blame him for making a different choice. He's been manipulated by Cartman more times than is probably worth trying to count, used as a decoy, employed as a cover story, recruited into schemes he didn't fully understand, exploited for his willingness to participate, and left holding the consequences when things went wrong. And he keeps coming back. Not because he's incapable of learning, he does learn, in the way a person with a good heart learns, which is slowly and with repeated setbacks, but because he genuinely likes people and wants to be included, and those instincts override the record of what's actually happened. His villainous alter ego, Professor Chaos, might be the most disarming character concept in the show's history. Butters, frustrated with how the world has treated him, decides to become a supervillain. Professor Chaos's evil plans include making a flood out of garden hoses, sending confusing letters, and other acts of extremely small-scale destruction that manage to inconvenience nobody significantly. He has a minion named General Disarray, another boy named Dougie, even more hapless than Butters, who supports him in these ventures. Professor Chaos is a child trying very hard to be threatening and succeeding mainly in being charming. He cannot bring himself to cause real harm. He just doesn't have it in him. There is a fan theory, unconfirmed, not denied, that positions Butters as the show's structural counterargument to its own most nihilistic impulses. South Park is a show that is frequently dark, frequently cynical, frequently contemptuous, of the idea that optimism is anything other than strategic naivety. It tends to end its arguments with, nothing helps, nothing changes, everyone is terrible, and the best you can do is laugh at it. Butters is the consistent exception to that. He's the one character around whom the show's cynicism keeps bending. Every time the show builds to the conclusion that people are fundamentally bad and hope is a kind of stupidity, Butters is there being kind anyway, not as a rebuttal, not as a lesson, just as a fact of who he is. The episodes built around Butters are consistently among the most beloved in the show's catalog. Butters' very own episode, the Professor Chaos arc, various Butters-centered stories across multiple seasons. They work, I think, because Butters is one of the few characters in the show about whom the audience has genuine affection rather than amused distance. You can watch Cartman and be fascinated, impressed, and horrified, and oddly entertained. You can watch Stan and find him relatable. But with Butters, you actually care about how things turn out for him. In a show that has often made carrying the punchline, that's genuinely unusual. The other fan theory worth mentioning here is the one that draws a connection between Butters and Kenny. The argument is that Butters is what Kenny might have been without the curse. The innocent child before the Cthulhu mythology attached itself to his life. The version of the poor, overlooked, underestimated boy whose parents' bad decisions didn't follow him into an eternity of dying alone. Unconfirmed, never denied. And honestly, as a reading of both characters, it fits in a way that feels meaningful rather than coincidental. What I keep coming back to with Butters is the quiet argument he makes just by existing. The show has been running for nearly 30 years. It has satirized almost everything. It has concluded repeatedly and with conviction that institutions fail, that adults are useless, that the world is run by people who are either stupid or self-serving or both. And through all of that, it has kept a character who decided to be good anyway. who keeps deciding it season after season in the face of everything the show knows about how the world actually works. That's worth noticing, and I think it's worth taking seriously. In October 2019, South Park aired Banned in China, Season 23, Episode 2. The episode follows Randy Marsh, attempting to expand his Stegrity Farms marijuana business into the Chinese market. Along the way, it satirizes directly, without particular subtlety, in the South Park style of making the target as visible as possible. Hollywood's long-established practice of altering or softening creative content to maintain access to Chinese audiences and distribution deals. The episode depicts what happens when a story gets changed to please a censor. It shows the calculation explicitly. This scene stays, this scene goes, this character becomes less threatening. This storyline gets softened because that's what it costs to do business there. The episode also depicts Winnie the Pooh in a prison camp, as an imprisoned figure specifically. This was not random or accidental. Winnie the Pooh had been banned in China years before the episode aired. The ban had originated from a wave of internet memes comparing the character's appearance to President Xi Jinping. The Chinese government, finding the comparison unwelcome, had extended increasingly broad censorship to Winnie the Pooh imagery across Chinese platforms and media. South Park's use of the character in a gulag context was a direct, purposeful reference to something specific, an animated image that a government had decided was dangerous. The Chinese response came quickly and completely. The government enacted a blanket ban on the entire South Park franchise. Not just Banned in China, not just the Winnie the Pooh scene, everything. The show was scrubbed from Baidu, Douban, Zhihu, Bilibili, Sina Weibo, and WeChat. Every episode, every reference, every discussion on major Chinese platforms. Not restricted or age-rated or given a warning. Removed. The word South Park became, in the context of Chinese internet platforms, a void. Parker and Stone's response was issued quickly, and it is, by any measure, one of the more extraordinary official statements a production company has ever made. I genuinely think about this statement sometimes. It's a masterclass in saying exactly what you think without dressing it up. The statement read, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy." She doesn't look like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune into our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great People's Republic of China and the Communist Party. May the allies of the free world enjoy South Park and other countries. Long live the party. The NBA reference in that statement was pointed and deliberate. At the time, the Houston Rockets general manager had tweeted in support of Hong Kong protests. The response from China had been swift and threatening, and various NBA players and executives had found themselves under considerable pressure to publicly distance themselves from the tweet and from the issue. Several had complied. Parker and Stone were explicitly placing themselves in the same situation and explicitly refusing to behave the way the NBA had. They were naming the choice and making the opposite one. The episode Banned in China had essentially predicted its own ban. The plot is about what happens when you decide to do business with a system that requires you to censor yourself, what you give up, what it costs, where the line is. The show made the argument, released the episode, got banned, and then responded by doubling down. The argument, the consequence, and the response formed a single, coherent statement across 3 separate acts. There's an irony worth noting about the ban's actual effect. South Park had been building an unofficial audience in China for years, through pirated content, through VPN access, through the same gray zone channels that deliver Western entertainment to audiences that official distribution hasn't reached. The ban couldn't touch those viewers. It wasn't capable of reaching the people who were actually watching the show through the mechanisms they had always used. And in Western markets, Banned in China was the most watched South Park episode since 2018 at the time of its release. The decision to ban the franchise produced a significantly larger audience for the episode that prompted the ban. I find this genuinely funny in the specific way that outcomes which contradict their own intentions are funny. The Streisand effect, essentially, deployed at the scale of a government. The Winnie the Pooh element has a specific resonance for South Park in particular. The show has itself been banned in multiple countries across its history. India banned it in 2010. China's blanket ban is the most complete and the most dramatic. Parker and Stone know what it means for a piece of creative work to be declared dangerous by a government. Using an image that a government had itself banned, a cartoon bear rendered threatening by official prohibition, as the centerpiece of an episode about censorship has a kind of structural logic that goes beyond simple provocation. One cartoon declared dangerous by one government, deployed in an episode by a show declared dangerous by another government, to make an argument about the practice of declaring things dangerous. The ban remains in effect. As of 2025, South Park has no official presence on major Chinese platforms. It has not been restored. Parker and Stone have not attempted to have it restored or made statements suggesting they intend to. The choice they made in their response statement appears to have been final. There's something in the completeness of the ban, its totality, the fact that it swept up the entire archive of a 28-season show rather than just the episode that prompted it, that says something about how seriously the Chinese government took a cartoon. The blanket ban is, in its own way, the most dramatic endorsement South Park has ever received. They were considered threatening enough to erase entirely. Whether Parker and Stone think of it that way, I don't know. But it's there. What's also worth noting is the speed of the ban's implementation. The Chinese government's removal of South Park from its platforms was essentially instantaneous. Not a regulatory process with notices and appeals, but a switch being thrown, the entire archive of a 22-year show, erased from public access on major platforms within days of a single episode airing. Ring. That level of responsiveness to a cartoon, the administrative energy required to scrub something that thoroughly, that fast, is its own kind of testament. You don't mobilize that kind of institutional response against something you consider harmless. All right, I think we've covered quite a lot tonight, and there's a version of this where we stop here, where I say good night, remind you that not every mystery needs to be solved, and let you drift off thinking about whichever part of the evening caught your attention most. Maybe it was Kenny, maybe it was the China statement, which is one of the most spectacular corporate responses in recent entertainment history. Maybe it was the name that sounded the same before and after it was officially changed. And honestly, I was going to wind down. I was genuinely preparing to say goodnight. But there's one more thing, one more layer, and it might be the most interesting one because it changes the way everything else we've talked about tonight sits. Because everything, the characters, the arcs, the censorship, the production chaos, all of it looks different once you understand how much of South Park is actually about the two people who made it. So, just a little while longer if you're still here, and if you're not, if you've already drifted off somewhere in the last section, that's completely fine. But if you're still with me, let's talk about the autobiography underneath the cartoon. Trey Parker has confirmed on multiple occasions in various interviews over the years that Stan Marsh is based on himself. This isn't a fan interpretation or an inference, he said it directly, without ambiguity. The evidence starts with the most immediate details. Stan's father is named Randy, his mother's named Sharon. Those are the actual first names of Trey Parker's real parents, Randy Parker and Sharon Parker. Stan's father is a geologist in the show. Trey Parker's real father, Randy Parker, is a geologist. The town Parker grew up in, Conifer, Colorado, about 40 miles east of Fairplay, outside the South Park Basin, is the geographical and atmospheric inspiration for the show's setting. Ting. The mountains in the background of the title card, the particular quality of Colorado winter that fills every outdoor scene, the sense of being in a small, isolated place that takes itself seriously but has no particular reason to. These are drawn from a real place that Parker actually knows. Matt Stone is Kyle. Stone is Jewish. Kyle is the show's Jewish character. Stone has described himself in various contexts as generally the more principled of the two in their creative partnership, the one more likely to draw a line somewhere, to push back against an idea on ethical grounds. Kyle is the show's moral voice, the character who keeps arguing that the town should behave better than it does, who maintains a kind of ethical insistence that the world consistently fails to reward. The parallel isn't exact, no autobiographical parallel ever is, but neither Parker nor Stone has disputed it, and the fit is clear enough that it functions as a quiet acknowledgement. Cartman is more complicated. Parker has been careful, across many years of interviews, not to claim Cartman as a self-portrait. There are obvious reasons for that, but he has said that writing Cartman provides a kind of cathartic function, that Cartman says things Parker wishes he could say, does things Parker cannot do, operates without the filters that Parker applies to his own public behavior. In this reading, Cartman is Parker's shadow, the part of himself that gets expressed through the character rather than through Parker himself at a safe fictional distance. The I'd contained within a cartoon, doing what the I'd does when nobody can stop it. And then there is Randy Marsh, who may be the most autobiographically significant character in the show's history, even though he started as a minor supporting role. Parker has acknowledged, in terms clear enough to be taken seriously, that Randy's evolution tracked his own. As a child, Parker identified with Stan, the grounded kid, the reasonable voice, the one watching the chaos with bewildered eyes. As Parker got older, Stan stopped reflecting where he was. The concerns that animated Stan, childhood friendships, school, navigating parents, and rules were no longer Parker's concerns. But Randy's concerns were the ego, the restlessness, the complicated relationship between wanting to do meaningful work and wanting to be recognized for doing it. The experience of having achieved more success than you expected and finding that the question, what now, doesn't get easier with the achievement. Randy's particular mode of self-defeating ambition, the way he throws himself into projects with complete confidence and then creates exactly the situation he was trying to avoid, maps onto something recognizable about creative people who've been doing something for a long time and aren't entirely sure how to assess what they've built. The Tegrity Farms era in this reading is at least partly a working through of those questions. What does it mean to change direction? What do you lose when you try something different? Is the new thing actually better or just new? And then there is You're Getting Old, which we touched on earlier in the Randy section and which deserves its full context here. The episode aired in season 15 in 2011. Stan develops an inability to perceive anything as genuinely good. Music sounds like flatulence. Films look like excrement. Everything he encounters registers as the same recycled garbage in different packaging. The marriage is struggling. The friendships are under strain. The episode ends without a proper resolution, which is unusual enough for South Park that the absence of a reset was itself the subject of significant discussion. Parker has never confirmed that the episode was autobiographical, but he's also never denied it. What he has said is that South Park reflects what he and Stone are actually thinking and feeling at any given time. And what You're Getting Old was feeling in 2011, 14 years into the show, in the middle of what had been a very long creative run, was something like genuine weariness. Not contempt for the audience, not bitterness about the work, just tiredness. The kind that accumulates when you've been doing something intensely for a long time and have started to wonder whether the thing you see when you look at the world is the world or just what you've trained yourself to see. The meta-conspiracy that sits underneath all of this is maybe the most interesting one in the whole series. South Park is a show that has made a career out of not caring, out of being iconoclastic, irreverent, untouchable, impossible to embarrass. It satirizes everything from an apparent position of total detachment. Nothing is sacred, nothing gets a pass. The show watches the world and laughs. But if the show is also, and the evidence suggests it is, a continuous autobiography of two people processing their lives and their changing relationship to the world they live in. Then the detachment is at least partly performance. Stan is Trey's childhood. Carefully Randy Marsh is based on Trey Parker's father, Ired. Kyle is Matt's conscience, maintained through decades of creative partnership. Cartman is something from both of them that neither wants to claim directly, but that keeps showing up in the work. These aren't just characters, they're ways of thinking about things. They're the show's creators at various ages, from various angles, talking about what it's like to be them. And the show that appears to care about nothing has been, underneath the surface, caring about that continuously since 1997. I find that genuinely moving, actually. Not in a way that demands a reaction, just in the way that something true sometimes sits with you quietly. Here's the thing that gets me when I think about all of this together. South Park has always been described from the outside as a show that doesn't care. The critics who don't like it characterize it as nihilism dressed as comedy, a show that tears everything down and builds nothing, that mocks without empathy, that performs detachment as sophistication. And there is genuinely something to that criticism. The show is often dark. It has caused genuine pain to real people. It has been cruel in ways that weren't always balanced by something more. But the autobiographical layer complicates that reading, because you can't be nihilistic about the things that are actually you. Parker can position South Park as a show that cares about nothing, but Stan Marsh is Trey Parker's childhood self standing at a bus stop in Colorado, reacting to the world with the same exhausted reasonableness that Parker brought to his own childhood. Kyle is Matt Stone's conscience, insisting on better standards decade after decade, even when the show's own logic argues against it. Randy is Parker's middle age, trying to figure out what comes next. These aren't satirical targets, they're self-portraits. A show made from self-portraits, however cleverly disguised, cares about something. It cannot help but care about something that might be the deepest conspiracy in South Park's 26 seasons. Sons. Not a plot line, not a fan theory, not a piece of hidden lore. Just the simple fact that the show that built its identity on not caring has been, in the parts of it that matter most, a very long act of caring about the two people who made it and the world they found themselves in. So, here we are. We started in 1992 with 2 university students making a construction paper Christmas film that nobody outside their class was supposed to see. We found our way to a $1,000 Christmas card that became a viral object before viral objects had a name. And from there to a television deal that a major network almost got and passed on, and to a pilot that took 3 months and was made from real paper and is somewhere in a storage room right now, probably in California. From there, we found Kenny McCormick, the boy in the orange parka, dying week after week in creative new ways, and the mythology that was waiting underneath all of it for 14 years. A cult joined for free beer, a mother placing a newborn in a tiny orange parka into a crib, a line of dialogue that recontextualizes everything that came before it. The real tragedy not being the dying, but the loneliness of being the only one who knows. We found Cartman, who has been the show's actual protagonist for most of its run without the show ever admitting it, whose defining moment involves a bowl of chili and a level of premeditation that is genuinely unsettling in a 9-year-old. We found Randy, who arrived as a background character and gradually became the show's center of gravity as its creator aged into a version of himself that Stan could no longer hold. We went into the 6-day machine, the 70 people working 120-hour weeks to get something onto a satellite uplink by Wednesday evening. The endings being rewritten while the beginnings were being animated. The episodes that got started and swallowed by the pace of the process before they could become anything. There are 5 South Park episodes that are no longer available to stream. More. The censorship that was applied without consent. The Emmy nomination for something that was difficult to watch because it had been altered by a third party. The consistent position maintained across years of controversy that treating one thing differently from everything else is not neutrality but a choice. We found Chef, and what he was to the show and what happened when he left, and the grief that sat underneath the anger and how it was handled. We found a name that sounded the same before and after it changed. We found the theme song, and Timmy quietly singing in the space where Kenny used to be, and 25 years of something hidden under the opening credits. We found Butters, who keeps deciding to be good in a show that mostly argues against it. And we found the autobiography underneath all of it, the two people at the center of the whole thing, processing their lives in a Colorado mountain town that doesn't exist, season after season, through characters who carry versions of who they are and who they were. Every thread leads to another thread. Every answer opens a new question. That's the nature of South Park, and it's the nature of anything that's been running long enough to accumulate real history. All right, I think it's really, truly time to start saying goodnight. But before I do, just one last image, because it's the one I always come back to, and I'd feel wrong ending without it. The bus stop, 4 boys, standing in the snow, facing the viewer. That image has been the opening of South Park since 1997. Some version of it has started hundreds of episodes. Stan in his red and blue hat, Kyle in his green Ushanka, Cartman in his red coat, and Kenny with his orange hood pulled tight over his face. Standing together, waiting for the school bus that never seems to arrive on screen, they're always still waiting when the story begins. They've been at that bus stop for nearly 30 years. They've never aged. The snow doesn't stop fall. And many episodes begin with some version of that same moment. 4 small figures in the snow, together, talking. King. What do they talk about? Everything and nothing. School, television, things their parents did, things they saw, things that seem enormously important and probably aren't. It's the kind of conversation that children have when they're killing. Time, casual, drifting, unstructured. The kind of conversation that happens when you have to be somewhere and the thing you're waiting for hasn't arrived yet. And in a show where everything is a conspiracy and nothing is a conspiracy simultaneously, where a character can die 100 times and nobody notices, where an entire country can ban you for a cartoon bear, where the protagonist changes without announcement, and the show's truest heart hides inside a character who arrived as a nameless background extra. The constant is that image. 4 small figures in the snow, still there, still talking. I don't know if I can fully articulate why that feels as significant as it does, but the show that is built on cynicism, that has made its name from the position that everything is absurd and institutions fail and the world is run by people who should not be trusted, that show has kept 4 children at a bus stop together for nearly 3 decades. Through cast departures and network censorship and government bans and production crises and the deaths of people who were part of it. Through the creative disillusionment of You're Getting Old and the protagonist swaps and the Tigridy Farms era and 28 seasons of the world going wrong in new and imaginative ways, the boys are still there. That's the longest running conspiracy in South Park, maybe. 4 friendships that have survived every reason to end. And here's the thing I keep coming back to at the end of a night like this. The show has been made season after season under conditions that would exhaust almost anyone. 6 days per episode for most of 28 years. A 6-day machine running on controlled chaos and people who work more hours than they probably should. The production failures are rare. The quality, by any reasonable measure, has been maintained for an extraordinary length of time. And underneath all of it, underneath the schedule, the controversy, the bannings and the censorship and the characters killed off and the network negotiations and everything else, there are 2 people who met at university in Colorado and decided to make something together, and they're still making it. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. South Park is, among many other things, a document of a creative friendship. Every episode is evidence that 2 people who started making paper cutouts in the early 1990s still have things to say to each other and to the world, still find the world interesting enough to respond to at 6-day intervals. still believe on some level that making the thing is worth the chaos of making the thing. The show has outlasted almost everything it satirized. Cultural trends that seem permanent, political moments that felt seismic, celebrities that dominated conversations for years. And still, the boys at the bus stop, the snow still falling, the bus still not arriving. All right, that's enough for tonight. The show will still be there in the morning. The boys will still be at the bus stop. Kenny will still be alive for now until he isn't, and then he'll be alive again. The mysteries will keep. Take a breath. Let the thoughts settle. The conspiracies will keep. They've been running since 1997, and they'll still be there tomorrow. If Kenny feels a bit heavier now, or Cartman a bit more central, or Randy's arc makes more sense in terms of what it's reaching for, that's what a long-running show does when you spend some time inside it. It gets richer the more you bring to it. And if you drifted off somewhere around the Tolkien section, or during the production bit, or back in the very beginning when the room went quiet, that's completely fine. Also entirely the point. And if you happen to dream tonight about a small frozen town where nothing makes sense and everything means something, well, you wouldn't be the first. Good night. Sleep well. See you next time.